Have you ever lived next to someone who treated your yard like it was their personal business? I thought Maple Ridge Estates was supposed to be peaceful, white fences, trimmed lawns, polite waves at the mailbox. But beneath that picture-perfect surface lurks something darker, an HOA enforcer named Karen Parkman. She wasn't just nosy. She was relentless, watching me through binoculars, peering over fences, even barging into my wife's birthday party. Every flower I planted, every decoration I set up became her battlefield. I tried to ignore it to play nice, but there comes a point when a man has to draw the line. And in my case, that line was drawn with water. Cold, unexpected, perfectly timed water. What started as an annoyance turned into a full-blown war of sprinklers versus snooping, and trust me, Karen never saw it coming. Before we dive into this chaotic saga, drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to see how far this HOA madness is reaching across the world. When I first moved into Maple Ridge Estates, I thought I had found the perfect slice of suburbia. The lawns were all cut with ruler-like precision, driveways gleamed from power washes, and the air carried the faint scent of freshly painted shutters. It felt almost cinematic, like I'd stumbled onto the set of one of those TV dramas where nothing bad ever happens. Of course I should have known better. Where there's an HOA, there's always someone eager to turn neighborly order into tyranny. That someone, in our case, was Karen Parkman. Karen had the sort of presence that could sour milk. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was an institution, a self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, a walking rulebook with lipstick always armed with a clipboard and a suspicious squint. On paper, she was just another homeowner with a seat on the HOA board. In reality, she wielded her position like a badge of honor, convinced she was Maple Ridge's last line of defense against chaos. At first, my interactions with her were small annoyances, the kind of encounters you'd vent about over coffee and then forget. My recycling bin once sat 6 inches past the curb, and within 24 hours I received a neatly typed letter from the HOA citing bin misplacement first warning. Another time, she left an unsigned note taped to my mailbox complaining about the offensive purple flowers I'd planted in my front bed. Offensive, mind you, as if my lavender had committed a hate crime. I brushed it off. I was new here, eager to avoid drama. My wife Maya urged me to be patient. She's just one of those people, she said. Keep your head down, don't give her a reason to notice you. Easier said than done. You see, I've always loved gardening. It's not just a hobby, it's therapy. After long hours stuck behind a screen, there's nothing better than putting my hands in the soil tending to the small universe of plants I'd cultivated. Roses, lavender, marigolds, it was my sanctuary. But apparently sanctuary doesn't exist in Karen's dictionary. It started subtly. I'd be pulling weeds or adjusting a trellis, and I'd feel her eyes on me. I'd glance up, and there she'd be standing at the edge of her yard, arms folded, watching like I was planting illegal contraband instead of tulips. At first she'd comment in that syrupy sweet voice people use when they're trying to disguise venom as honey. "Lovely day, isn't it, Daniel?" she'd say. Or, "Those petunias are bold. Don't you think white would blend better with the neighborhood theme?" As if we were all living in some suburban amusement park designed by her personal tastes. Her suggestions turned into lectures. Fertilizer ratios, watering schedules, how my stepping stones looked too rustic compared to the others. She even criticized my bird feeder because it attracted squirrels, which she claimed were undesirable wildlife. I nearly asked her if she'd rather I attract mountain lions instead. But the staring didn't stop there. One night, while making dinner, I caught her peering straight into my kitchen window. Another morning, I found her inspecting my trash cans on garbage day, lifting lids like she was performing some kind of forensic audit. When I asked what in God's name she was doing, she smiled that infuriating smile and chirped, "Just making sure you're recycling properly, Daniel." Then came the anonymous tips to the HOA. Little slips of paper slid under my door or left in my mailbox. "Your garden gnome exceeds the allowable height limit by half an inch. Your wind chimes are disruptive to community peace." I knew exactly who was behind them. Who else in their right mind would care about the precise legal standing of a gnome? I tried everything to keep her at bay. A polite conversation, she turned it into a lecture about bylaws. A row of hedges, I later spotted her on a stepladder, binoculars in hand, peeking over like a deranged wildlife photographer. I even put up a no trespassing sign, which she had the audacity to call unneighborly. The breaking point came during Maya's birthday party. I'd planned it for weeks, a quiet gathering of close friends and family with food, music, and a cake I had secretly ordered from her favorite bakery downtown. The backyard was strung with fairy lights, the grill was going, and for once I felt proud of the life we'd built here. Then came the intrusion. Just as I carried out the cake candles glowing, everyone ready to sing, the gate banged open. Surprised, Karen shouted as if she'd been invited. The music stopped, conversations froze, and every eye turned toward her. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm even as my blood pressure spiked. "Oh, I just noticed all the cars parked outside," she said, smiling like the Grinch. "Thought I'd pop in, make sure everything was in order. You know, noise levels, trash disposal, all that." She didn't stop there. She walked straight to the buffet table, sniffing the food. "Too much sugar," she muttered. Then she eyed the decorations. "A little colorful, don't you think?" Finally, she scanned the guests as though running a background check. Maya's jaw tightened. I'll never forget the look on her face, that mix of anger and embarrassment as her special day unraveled under Karen's intrusion. The laughter died, the mood soured, and before long people started making excuses to leave early. Karen had successfully torpedoed the one evening I wanted to dedicate to my wife. That night, Maya turned to me and said, "Enough is enough, Daniel. She's not just annoying anymore, she's invading our lives." And she was right. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every incident like a highlight reel of frustration. The notes, the spying, the ruined birthday. I felt like a character in some twisted suburban thriller, hunted not by a criminal but by a neighbor with too much time and too little self-awareness. That's when it hit me. I couldn't keep playing defense. I needed to send a message, not through confrontation, not through shouting matches, but through something she'd understand, something she'd feel. I laughed quietly to myself as the idea formed. Water. That was it. Cold, cleansing, unavoidable water. If Karen wanted to lurk, she'd get a front-row seat to a sprinkler system unlike anything Maple Ridge had ever seen. At dawn the next morning, I called my buddy Marcus. He was the kind of guy who lived for do-it-yourself. Projects half his garage was filled with tools, spare lumber, and gadgets he'd tinkered with over the years. When I explained my plan, he chuckled, then said, "Daniel, I've been waiting my whole life for a project like this. Let's give her the shower she deserves." It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming our home, our peace, and if I'm honest, a little bit of joy in watching Karen finally taste the consequences of her nosiness. I had no idea then just how far things would spiral, or how many gallons of water would be involved. But one thing was clear: the sprinkler war of Maple Ridge Estates was about to begin. The day after Maya's ruined birthday, I woke up with a single thought pounding in my head: this couldn't go on. My sanctuary, my garden, the one place where I found peace after long days of work, had been turned into a stage for Karen's obsessions. She wasn't just nosy, she was invasive, relentless, and dangerously creative. I needed to get ahead of her, to reclaim not just my yard but my dignity. At first I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just her personality, maybe she didn't realize how far she'd crossed the line. But then I walked outside with my morning coffee and caught her crouching near my rose bushes, jotting notes onto her clipboard. She jumped like a thief caught red-handed when she saw me. "Oh, good morning, Daniel," she stammered, her tone sugary but her eyes sharp. "Just observing. Your roses are spreading closer to the property line. I'll need to report that if it exceeds 6 inches. 6 inches. She was measuring roses as if they were contraband. That was when I started digging deeper, not in the soil but in the law. I spent nights reading about property rights, nuisance laws, and harassment statutes. I discovered that in our state, homeowners had strong protections against repeated, unwanted surveillance and intrusion. If I documented her behavior, if I gathered enough evidence, I could theoretically pursue legal action. But the thought of dragging my family through months of legal battles wasn't appealing. I wanted something immediate, something practical, and yes, something that would sting. Karen didn't just peek, she escalated. Within days, she started peering through binoculars over the hedges I had planted for privacy. I had invested hundreds of dollars in those shrubs, and yet there she was, climbing a bright red stepladder like some deranged bird watcher. One evening, I returned home from work to find my trash can suspiciously open. I reviewed my security footage, and there she was, Karen rifling through my garbage bags under the pretense of ensuring recycling compliance. I played the footage 3 times in disbelief. Who does that? As if that wasn't enough, HOA envelopes began arriving. A concerned resident had reported that my garden gnome exceeded height restrictions by ½ an inch. Anonymous complaints alleged my wind chimes disrupted the neighborhood's tranquility. Every note carried the same tone of petty authority, and though unsigned, the fingerprints of Karen's obsession were all over them. Maya urged me to talk to her to be the bigger person. So I did. One Saturday morning, I walked over to her driveway where she stood in yoga pants, clutching a water bottle, and announced, "Karen, I'd appreciate it if you stopped watching and reporting on my property." It's becoming harassment. Her smile didn't waver, but her tone chilled. Oh, Daniel, you misunderstand. I'm not harassing you, I'm protecting our community. Standards matter. If you can't follow them, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you. That was her line, her way of telling me she didn't care about boundaries, only about control. I thought the hedgerow would help. I planted them thick and tall, a living wall of green meant to grant us some privacy. But one morning I looked out the kitchen window to see her standing on that same stepladder, peering right over with binoculars. The audacity would have been comical if it wasn't so infuriating. Then came the birthday debacle. Karen's intrusion had already cut deep, but Maya's words afterward lit the final fuse. She's not just ruining your garden, Daniel. She's ruining our life. It was true. Karen had wormed her way into every corner of our peace. I couldn't let it continue. That's when I called Marcus. Marcus and I went back years, college roommates, weekend fishing buddies, the guy who could fix anything with duct tape and sheer willpower. If there was one person who could help me bring this idea to life, it was him. When I told him what I had in mind, he grinned like a kid in a candy store. A motion-activated sprinkler system. Oh, this is going to be beautiful. We're not just watering grass here, we're defending territory. Over pizza and a few too many beers, we sketched out the plan on napkins. The idea wasn't just to water plants, it was to cover every choke point Karen favored. The gate where she barged in the flower beds, she critiqued the trash cans she investigated, and of course the windows she liked to peek through. I spent hours researching online. Multi-zone systems, rotor heads with adjustable spray patterns, high-pressure nozzles capable of sending a blast 20 feet. One model even boasted infrared motion detection precise enough to trigger at the faintest movement. I was practically drooling at the specs. I wasn't just installing sprinklers, I was building a defensive perimeter. But before I could fully commit, I wanted to test just how far Karen was willing to go. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I left a small box on my porch labeled fertilizer samples. Inside was nothing but shredded paper. I set up a camera facing it. Sure enough, at 10 o'clock that night, Karen crept across my lawn like a burglar, picked up the box, opened it, and frowned when she found nothing inside. Then she scurried back into the darkness, her expression sourer than spoiled milk. That was it. Proof that she was trespassing, snooping, and escalating. I didn't need any more justification. The sprinkler project was a go. The following Saturday, Marcus arrived with his truck full of tools. We dug trenches along the property lines, laid out PVC piping, and tested different nozzle angles. It felt less like gardening and more like engineering a fortress. Neighbors slowed their cars to watch us, curious but too polite to ask questions. I caught more than one amused smile, as if they suspected something but didn't want to be involved. At one point, Marcus accidentally triggered a prototype sprinkler, drenching himself from head to toe. Consider it a baptism, he laughed, wringing out his shirt. I meanwhile managed to get tangled in a coil of tubing looking like a mummy wrapped in plastic. It was messy, exhausting work, but every time I pictured Karen's smug face getting hit with a blast of cold water, I pushed harder. By sundown, we had the system in place. All that remained was calibration, testing the sensors, adjusting the spray arcs, and setting the timing. Standing there in the twilight, watching the sprinklers arc streams of water across the lawn, I felt something I hadn't felt in months' anticipation. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about drawing a boundary Karen couldn't ignore. She'd mocked the hedges, ignored the signs, dismissed my words, but water would be undeniable. That night, I lay in bed grinning, waiting for the inevitable. And as fate would have it, Karen didn't make me wait long. The first time it happened, I almost felt guilty. Almost. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was home working at my desk when I heard a high-pitched shriek slice through the quiet suburban air. At first, I thought maybe a kid had fallen off a bike. But then, I remembered the motion sensors were armed. My heart thudded in my chest as I pulled back the blinds. There she was. Karen stood in my flower bed, her pristine white pantsuit plastered to her legs, her hair dripping in strands across her face. She looked less like the HOA queen bee and more like a drowned cat dragged through a storm drain. The sprinkler near the roses hissed and sputtered, showering her in another perfectly timed blast. I could have stayed hidden. I could have enjoyed the view from inside. But something mischievous took hold of me. I slid open the back door, feigning concern. "Oh, Karen, did you get wet?" I had no idea the new sprinkler system was running. Her glare could have scorched steel. "You," she sputtered, wiping water from her mascara-streaked cheeks. "You did this on purpose." "On purpose," I repeated, tilting my head like I was genuinely confused. "Why would I? I'm just trying to keep my lawn green. Community standards, you know." She muttered something about inconsiderate neighbors and water waste, then stormed off, leaving a trail of soggy footprints behind her. I closed the door, shut the blinds, and laughed so hard I nearly cried. For the first time in months, the power balance had shifted. But that was just the beginning. Over the next week, Karen seemed magnetically drawn to every sprinkler zone on my property. It was as if the system had developed a personal vendetta. One morning, she leaned over my trash cans to inspect whether I'd properly sorted recyclables. A jet of icy water blasted her square in the chest. I didn't even have to lift a finger. The sensors triggered, and in a blink, both of them were shrieking, soaked from head to toe. Evelyn's wig slipped sideways, dangling like seaweed. Karen flailed, sputtering about lawsuits. It was slapstick comedy at its finest, worth every penny I'd sunk into that system. I saved the footage from my security cameras. In fact, I replayed it nightly, chuckling like a villain in a bad movie. Maybe it was petty, but after months of being spied on, lectured, and harassed, the sight of Karen reduced to a soggy spectacle was cathartic. Of course, she didn't take it lying down. A few days later, I noticed tape covering one of the motion sensors. Another morning, the sprinkler heads had been twisted at odd angles. Once my water supply mysteriously shut off, though I'd prepared with a backup tank. She was clearly sneaking onto my property at night, desperate to disable my defenses. I responded in kind. Protective covers for the sensors, extra cameras in the hedges, a water pressure monitor inside the garage. If she wanted to play dirty, I'd play smarter. Still, the encounters grew increasingly absurd. On a Saturday morning, I was trimming my now perfectly hydrated petunias when Karen stormed up the driveway, face flushed, fists clenched. "This has to stop, Daniel," she shouted. "These sprinklers are a menace, weapons of mass irrigation." I almost burst out laughing. "They're sprinklers, Karen," I said, calmly wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. "They water my lawn. You know, keeping it green, community standards." "You're doing this on purpose," she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You're trying to drown me," I shrugged. "Maybe if you stayed on your own property, you wouldn't get wet." She gasped like I'd slapped her. "I have a right to inspect. To ensure compliance, inspect what I asked," raising an eyebrow. "My roses, my gnomes, my legally compliant lawn." Before she could respond, one of the sprinklers popped up right beside us, spraying her full in the face. The timing was so perfect I couldn't have scripted it better. She shrieked, sputtered, and stormed off, muttering about calling her lawyer. Word spread quickly through Maple Ridge Estates. Neighbors whispered, some chuckled openly, others avoided the topic altogether. A few even gave me discreet thumbs up when Karen wasn't looking. Another day, she crept up to peer through my kitchen window, only for a rotor head on the porch to arc a cascade straight onto her carefully styled hair. The best moment, though, came when she dragged along another HOA loyalist, Evelyn Hayes. Evelyn had a reputation for quoting bylaws from memory, the kind of woman who once scolded kids for riding scooters on the sidewalk. Together they marched onto my lawn, clipboards in hand like suburban stormtroopers. Once she even used a child's periscope, poking it above my fence to peer into my backyard. Each attempt ended the same way, a jet of water catching her off guard, sending her scrambling, soaked and furious. I began adding fun modes to the system. A mist setting for hot days, a rainbow mode with colored lights for extra spectacle, even a randomized soak pattern that made her attempts unpredictable. To me, it was strategy. To Karen, it must have felt like psychological warfare. But the more she fumed, the more I realized this wasn't just a petty feud. It was a battle over privacy control and the right to be left alone in your own home. And for once I was winning. The HOA, however, was about to get involved. And when they did, things would spiral into territory even I hadn't anticipated. For now, though, I leaned back on my porch, sipping iced tea as my sprinklers hissed and clicked, ready to defend. The HOA board meeting had all the charm of a dentist's waiting room, only with more hostility and less Novocaine. It was held in the community center, a beige, soulless building with flickering fluorescent lights that hummed as if they too dreaded what was about to unfold. I hadn't attended one in months. Frankly, I'd avoided them because they were usually nothing more than Karen's stage to grandstand about lawn lengths and mailbox paint colors. But this time, I knew my name was on the agenda. I walked in to find Karen already at the front of the room, papers fanned out like evidence in a courtroom. Her hair was still damp from an earlier incident, her blouse clinging uncomfortably to her shoulders. When she saw me, her lips curled into a tight smile that screamed, "Gotcha." "Residents," she began, raising her voice with theatrical projection, "we have a serious problem. A menace has invaded our neighborhood, threatening safety, wasting resources, and creating hazards for us all." A murmur rippled through the room. A few neighbors leaned forward with interest, others rolled their eyes. I spotted Marcus in the back row, smirking, arms folded. He'd shown up purely for moral support, and maybe to enjoy the fireworks. Karen slammed a photo onto the table. A blurry printout of herself, drenched mascara, streaked her expression, frozen in shock. This, she declared, jabbing a finger at the photo, is what I've endured because of Daniel Miller's sprinkler system. Weapons of aquatic aggression strategically designed to target me. Laughter broke out in the back row before quickly dying under Karen's glare. I raised an eyebrow. Sprinklers, Karen. They're called sprinklers. Most suburban homes have them. She turned on me like a hawk. Not like yours. These are motion-activated high-pressure devices intended not for watering grass but for harassment. The board chair, a weary-looking man named Peter who clearly regretted ever volunteering, cleared his throat. Mr. Miller, would you like to respond? I stepped forward holding my folder of neatly printed notes. Gladly. First, every sprinkler head is fully on my property. There is no HOA bylaw prohibiting motion-activated irrigation. Second, the system is calibrated for landscaping, which explains why my lawn is the greenest it's ever been. And third, I pause for effect, glancing at Karen. If anyone is getting wet, it's because they're somewhere they shouldn't be. A ripple of chuckles passed through the audience. Karen's face flushed scarlet. Before she could counter, an older gentleman adjusted his glasses and spoke up. George Lang, retired attorney, 3 houses down. He was known for being quiet at meetings, but when he spoke, people listened. Karen, he said calmly, if Mr. Miller's system is on his property, it's his right. Now, if you are repeatedly entering that property and activating the sprinklers, that raises other issues of harassment, even trespassing. I'd caution you, as someone who's practiced law for 40 years, that pursuing this could backfire. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. For once, she was speechless. Then Evelyn Hayes piped up, the same neighbor who'd been drenched alongside her. Adjusting her damp wig, she sighed. Honestly, my front lawn's been struggling. If Daniel's system works this well, maybe we should be thanking him instead of fighting him. Gasps. Betrayal. Karen shot Evelyn a glare that could curdle blood, but Evelyn simply shrugged as if to say, I've had enough of this nonsense. The meeting ended in a stalemate. No official action was taken, no fines issued. Karen stormed out, muttering about water terrorism and legal action. I, on the other hand, left with a small victory under my belt and the distinct sense that this war was far from over. And oh, how right I was. In the days that followed, Karen doubled down. If she couldn't win through the board, she'd win through persistence. She began patrolling my property like a spy on assignment. She donned a neon yellow raincoat, carried an oversized umbrella, and marched across the lawn as if she could intimidate the sprinklers into submission. Of course, the sprinklers had no respect for intimidation. The sensors tripped, and a torrent of water slammed into her umbrella, flipping it inside out. Neighbors on porches stifled laughter behind coffee mugs. Another time she tried a stealth approach, crawling across the grass in camouflage pants, army style. She didn't make it 3 feet before a rotor head popped up and blasted her so hard she yelped, slipping in the mud like a cartoon character. But my personal favorite was the periscope incident. One evening, I noticed something odd bobbing above my hedge line. At first, I thought it was a bird feeder until I realized it was Karen crouching with a child's toy periscope, peering into my yard like she was conducting surveillance for the CIA. The sprinkler on the roof activated, sending a waterfall straight down onto her head. The periscope clattered to the ground as she shrieked, stumbling back into her driveway, soaked to the bone. By then, the entire neighborhood was in on the spectacle. People began referring to it as the sprinkler war. Some even placed bets on how long it would take Karen to get soaked again. I heard kids whispering about Karen Watch as if it were a game. Even Maya, who had initially been skeptical about my plan, began to chuckle every time she caught Karen darting across the lawn, only to be ambushed by water. Still, part of me worried. I wasn't blind to the escalation. This wasn't just slapstick comedy, it was obsession, and obsession could turn dangerous. I reinforced the system with backup sensors and added tamper alarms. Marcus suggested installing a mist mode to create fog of war. I laughed, but secretly considered it. One night, as I reviewed footage from my cameras, I caught Karen attempting to sabotage a sprinkler head with a plastic bag. The system activated mid-reach, blasting her so hard she toppled backwards, sprawled in the grass like a rag doll. It was hilarious, yes, but also alarming. She was risking injury just to prove a point. The HOA tried to step in again. Another emergency meeting was called where Karen, dripping wet, yet again demanded sanctions against me. This time she called me a water terrorist, which nearly sent Marcus into a fit of laughter so loud he had to leave the room. The board, exhausted by her antics, sided with common sense. They told her plainly, unless she had evidence that my sprinklers violated a rule, there was nothing they could do. That should have been the end of it. But for Karen, defeat was never an option. Her tactics became more erratic. She wore ponchos in 90-degree heat. She carried tarps to shield herself only to slip and tumble when the grass grew slick. Once she even recruited her teenage nephew to sneak onto my property and cover the sensors, but the boy bolted after a single spray, leaving Karen screeching from the sidewalk. It was absurd, exhausting, and at times genuinely concerning. Yet I couldn't deny the strange satisfaction I felt each time the sprinklers did their job. For months I'd been her victim, now I was in control. The neighborhood saw it too. Karen wasn't the enforcer anymore. She was the spectacle. And though I didn't know it yet, all of this was building to the breaking point, the moment when Karen would finally lose whatever restraint she had left, and the sprinkler war would explode into something far bigger, wetter, and wilder than anyone could have imagined. Because if you push someone like Karen far enough, she doesn't just snap quietly, she snaps loud, and the sound of that snap was closer than I realized. By midsummer, my lawn was the envy of Maple Ridge Estates. Thick green, perfectly hydrated. Every blade of grass shimmered in the morning dew, as if the entire yard had been dipped in glass. Neighbors walking their dogs often paused, complimenting me in hushed tones. "Looks like a golf course, Daniel," or "Never seen roses that bright before." Some even whispered, "Keep it up, man, we're rooting for you." Everyone knew why my yard looked so good. It wasn't just the fertilizer or the soil. It was my army of motion-activated sprinklers, my watery shield against HOA tyranny. And as my garden thrived, Karen's patience withered. She hated losing control. You could see it in her face every time she glanced across the street, watching my yard gleam like an emerald jewel, while her own grass struggled under the summer Sunday. She hated that the neighborhood had begun to laugh, not at me but at her. The more she ranted about weapons of aquatic aggression, the more people snickered behind her back. So of course she escalated. One Sunday morning, I was sipping coffee on the porch, when Karen stomped down the street, dragging a rolling cart stacked with folders. She looked like a lawyer preparing for a murder trial. Behind her marched Evelyn Hayes, clipboard in hand, and two other HOA loyalists I barely recognized. They looked nervous, glancing at Karen as if they weren't sure whether to follow her or run away. She stopped right in front of my driveway and announced, "Daniel Miller, we are convening an emergency inspection." I set my mug down slowly, savoring the moment. "Funny," I said, "because I don't recall giving you permission to set foot on my property." Karen's nostrils flared. "As a representative of the Maple Ridge HOA, I have every right to inspect for violations." That was my cue. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a slim folder of my own. "Actually, you don't. State law makes it clear HOA authority stops at the property line unless granted access. And you don't have it." Her face twitched. "That law doesn't apply here." From the crowd gathering on the sidewalks, a familiar voice rang out, George Lang, the retired attorney. He stepped forward, adjusting his cap. "It applies everywhere in this state, Karen. I suggest you stop before you make things worse for yourself." The murmurs from the neighbors grew louder. Karen's little inspection parade was crumbling. She tried to salvage it by flipping open a binder, waving papers in the air. "These sprinklers are a nuisance. They endanger the community." Marcus, who had conveniently appeared with his camera phone already recording, shouted, "Endanger the community. Lady, it's water." The crowd laughed and Karen's cheeks flushed crimson. But she wasn't done. She lunged forward, shoving a piece of paper into my hand. "Cease and desist," she barked. "You are hereby ordered to remove the sprinkler system within 7 days or face escalating fines." I scanned the document. It wasn't official, it was something she'd clearly typed up herself, complete with her signature, but no HOA letterhead, no legal authority. It was theater. I held it up for the crowd to see. "Everyone take a look at this. Karen just served me a fake legal order. This isn't HOA stationery, it isn't signed by the board, and it certainly isn't enforceable." Gasps. Laughter. Even Evelyn Hayes seemed to shrink back, realizing she'd been dragged into something messy. Karen tried to snatch the paper back, but I pulled it away. "You've just crossed into harassment, Karen. And if you keep this up, I'll have no choice but to file a real complaint, this time with the county sheriff." The tension was thick enough to cut with a spade. Karen's lips trembled. For a moment I thought she might actually retreat, but then like a cornered animal she lashed out. "You think you've won. You haven't seen what I can do." With that she spun on her heel and stormed off, her little entourage scattering behind her. The crowd dispersed, buzzing with gossip. Some neighbors shook my hand, others patted me on the back. Marcus leaned in and whispered that my friend was a knockout punch. But I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to give up after a single defeat. No, she'd just reload, sharpen her claws, and come back harder. And sure enough, a week later, the HOA board summoned me to a formal hearing. The hearing was held in the same soulless community center, but this time the entire board sat behind a long table like judges in a kangaroo court. Karen sat at the far end, arms crossed, her smirk returning. She had stacks of documents piled in front of her like ammunition. Mr. Miller, the chairman, began. The board has received multiple complaints regarding your sprinkler system. Today, we will hear arguments from both sides. Karen leapt to her feet, launching into a tirade about water, waste, safety hazards, property damage, and even psychological trauma. She waved photos of herself, drenched photos of Evelyn, mid-shriek, even screenshots of my yard, mid-soak, as if they were evidence of war crimes. When she finally sat down, the room buzzed with her performance. She looked smug, convinced she'd nailed me to the wall. Then it was my turn. I stood calm, collected my notes, organized. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, what you've just witnessed is not evidence, it's theater. Every sprinkler on my property is installed legally, professionally, and in accordance with local ordinances. There is no bylaw in the Maple Ridge HOA that prohibits motion-activated irrigation. There is no rule about nozzle pressure sensor triggers or water arcs. Everything Karen has presented today is her personal grievance, not a violation. I paused, then held up a USB drive. And here's my evidence: security footage of Karen repeatedly trespassing, tampering with my sprinkler heads, and in some cases rifling through my trash. If anyone here is guilty of misconduct, it isn't me, the board murmured. Karen paled. George Lang spoke up from the audience. I've reviewed Mr. Miller's evidence. If the board attempts to sanction him without a legitimate bylaw violation, you could open yourselves to legal liability, harassment, invasion of privacy, even defamation if these accusations continue. That landed like a gavel strike. Even the board members who usually sided with Karen shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the chairman sighed. At this time, the board cannot find evidence of a violation. Mr. Miller's sprinkler system is permitted to remain. Applause erupted. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Karen sat frozen, her jaw tight, her plans crumbling around her. For me, the hearing was more than a victory, it was vindication. After months of being spied on, lectured, and harassed, the HOA itself had ruled in my favor. My sprinklers weren't just legal, they were untouchable. But as I walked out of that room, basking in triumph, I caught Karen's eyes. They burned with something darker than anger. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because when people like Karen lose power, they don't walk away quietly. They scheme, they plot, they wait for the moment to strike again. And that moment, I would soon discover, would come in the most chaotic, water-soaked showdown Maple Ridge had ever seen. After the hearing, life in Maple Ridge, estates should have gone back to normal. My sprinklers had been declared legal, my evidence had exposed Karen's antics, and the board had essentially told her to back off. For a few brief, glorious days, I thought I'd finally won. I watered my petunias in peace, grilled burgers without someone lurking, and even caught myself humming while mowing the lawn. But peace, as I soon learned, was only an illusion. Because Karen didn't surrender, she adapted. It began with her attire. She stopped coming onto my property in business casual or pastel blouses. Instead, she started wearing a bright yellow raincoat hood cinched tight, carrying a massive black umbrella like a medieval shield. In 90-degree heat, neighbors tried to stifle their laughter as she marched up the sidewalk, umbrella outstretched, daring my sprinklers to fire. When they did, the water hammered against her umbrella, drenching her legs anyway. She shrieked in outrage, stomping back to her porch while kids on bicycles whispered sprinkler war. Then came her nighttime raids. My cameras caught her crawling on her belly across the lawn, army-style flashlight gripped between her teeth. She'd reach for a sprinkler head, only for the sensor to trigger and unleash a jet of icy water straight into her face. She scrambled back, soaked and furious, shaking her fist at my hedges like a cartoon villain. Marcus and I watched the footage together one night over beers. He nearly fell off the couch laughing. She looks like she's training for a Navy SEAL mission and failing miserably. I chuckled but stayed cautious. Her persistence worried me. People don't crawl through mud at midnight unless they're obsessed. An obsession I knew could turn dangerous. That's when I upgraded the system. I added what Marcus dubbed random soak mode, a feature that triggered sprinklers at unpredictable intervals. No matter how carefully Karen timed her incursions, she never knew when the water would strike. I also installed a mist setting for hot afternoons and a rainbow projector that turned the spray into a shimmering light show. My yard became less a suburban lawn and more a watery fortress with a sense of humor. The neighborhood took notice. Soon, people stopped avoiding the spectacle and started enjoying it. Kids gathered on sidewalks with popcorn. Adults pretended to walk their dogs just to linger near my property, waiting for Karen's next failed mission. Even the mailman admitted, best entertainment I've had on this route in 20 years. Karen must have realized she'd become a joke. And if there's one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was being laughed at. So she upped the ante. One morning I woke to find plastic bags tied over several sprinkler heads. Another day, the water main valve to my house had been mysteriously turned off. Once I even found peanut butter smeared on my sensor covers, an attempt I assumed to clog them. I fixed each sabotage, documenting everything on camera, but the pattern was clear. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was waging a campaign. It all came to a head on a bright Saturday afternoon. I was pruning my roses when Karen stormed up the driveway, face twisted with rage. She wasn't armed with a clipboard this time. She carried a shovel. "This ends today," she screamed, voice echoing across the cul-de-sac. "I'll dig up every last one of those infernal contraptions." Before I could respond, she plunged the shovel into my flower bed, hacking at the soil. Neighbors gasped from their porches. Maya rushed out shouting, "Karen, stop, you're trespassing." But Karen didn't stop. She was consumed, hair, wild eyes blazing. "You think you can humiliate me?" she shrieked. "I'll show you." What she forgot, or perhaps never realized, was that the motion sensors were still armed. The moment she lifted the shovel for another strike, the first sprinkler popped up and blasted her side. She staggered, but pressed forward, digging harder. Then another sprinkler activated, soaking her from behind. She spun in fury, and in doing so tripped the sensors for the next zone. Suddenly, every sprinkler in my yard erupted in unison, a dozen jets of water firing from all directions. It was chaos, a watery symphony. Karen's spun and flailed umbrella, forgotten shovel clattering to the ground. Streams of water pummeled her, drenching her raincoat until it clung like a second skin. She slipped, landing in the mud with a loud splat. Every attempt to rise triggered another sensor, another blast. Within seconds, she looked like she'd been dropped in a hurricane. The neighborhood erupted in laughter. Phones came out. Kids cheered. Even George Lang chuckled, muttering, "Justice, finally." But the sprinklers weren't done. Because she kept moving, the random soak mode kicked in, sending unpredictable arcs that forced her to stumble and crawl. At one point, a rainbow shimmered across the spray, casting her soggy, furious figure in a ridiculous, almost magical light. It was the closest thing to slapstick divine comedy I'd ever witnessed. Finally, drenched, defeated, and covered in mud, Karen scrambled to her feet and staggered off my lawn. She didn't shout threats this time. She didn't wave her fist. She just trudged home silently, leaving wet footprints across the pavement. The silence that followed was almost as loud as the laughter. Neighbors exchanged glances, realizing they'd just witnessed the climax of the sprinkler war. Someone even started clapping, and soon the whole block joined in. I stood there, soaked myself from the spray roses, forgotten in my hands, and for the first time I felt not just victorious, but vindicated. This wasn't just about sprinklers or privacy anymore. It was about the community, seeing through Karen's facade, about her losing the grip she'd held over everyone for years. That night, Marcus texted me a video. He'd stitched together clips from everyone's phones, complete with dramatic music and slow-motion edits. He titled it "The Day Karen Fell." I watched it 3 times before bed, grinning ear to ear. But even as I laughed, a part of me wondered, was this truly over, or had I only poured gasoline, or rather water, on a fire that would burn hotter than ever? Karen, humiliated, might retreat, or she might plot. And with people like her, plotting was inevitable. All I knew for certain was that the war had shifted. No longer was I just defending my garden. Now the whole neighborhood was watching, waiting. And somehow I had become the accidental general of the most ridiculous battle suburbia had ever seen. If the sprinkler war had been a comedy up to this point, what came next turned it into a full-blown suburban epic. The afternoon Karen charged onto my lawn with that shovel wasn't just a defeat for her, it was a turning point for everyone in Maple Ridge Estates. Word spread like wildfire. By the following week, even residents who usually avoided drama were whispering about it at block parties, PTA meetings, and grocery checkout lines. The spectacle of Karen flailing in the mud under a rainbow spray of water had gone viral, thanks to Marcus, of course. He'd uploaded the stitched video of her meltdown into our neighborhood Facebook group, disguised under the title "Community Safety Awareness." Within hours, the comments section exploded. Some neighbors cheered, others begged for popcorn emojis, and a handful, mostly Karen's dwindling supporters, scolded Marcus for mocking a board member. But the tide had turned. The queen bee of the HOA had been knocked clean off her throne. Still, Karen wasn't finished. People like her never are. 3 days later, at precisely dawn, I woke to the sound of metallic clanking outside. I peeked through the blinds and nearly spat out my coffee. There she was again, clad in a camo poncho, rubber boots, and believe it or not, a pair of swimming goggles. Strapped to her back was a plastic kitty shield painted green as if she'd raided a dollar store and fashioned herself into a suburban gladiator. In her hands, a crowbar. She advanced toward my yard like she was storming Normandy, but the sensors were waiting. The sprinklers hissed to life, dousing her from all sides. The crowbar slipped from her wet hands and clanged onto the pavement. She screamed in frustration, shaking her fist at my roof camera. I stepped outside, arms crossed. "Karen, I warned you. This is trespassing. I've documented every incident. One more stunt like this, and I'll file a police report." Her goggles dripped. Her poncho clung like plastic wrap. But her voice still rang with venom. "This isn't over, Miller. You can't drown me out forever." With that, she stumbled off, leaving puddles in her wake. I thought maybe, just maybe, the embarrassment would finally end it. But the very next day, I received a notice the HOA was convening a special emergency meeting. Clearly, Karen had pulled strings, desperate to reclaim her power. The meeting room was packed. Everyone knew this was the showdown. Karen sat at the front with her loyalists flanked by soggy photos and water-damaged evidence. Her voice trembled with both rage and desperation as she addressed the board. "These sprinklers," she declared, pounding the table, "are not just a nuisance. They are weapons. I've been assaulted, humiliated, and subjected to psychological torment." She gestured to Evelyn, who winced but nodded reluctantly. "We've both endured unnecessary suffering." I waited for my turn, calm as ever. When the chairman finally looked to me, I stepped forward with my laptop. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard Karen's story. Now let's look at the truth." I played the footage. Karen crawling through my lawn at midnight. Karen covering sensors with tape. Karen digging with a shovel. Karen wielding a crowbar. Each clip was time-stamped, each angle clear as daylight. The room gasped. Some people laughed outright. George Lang, ever the voice of reason, stood. "It's plain to see, folks. Mr. Miller's system is legal and within his rights. Miss Parkman, however, has repeatedly trespassed, tampered with property, and fabricated claims. If this continues, she opens not only herself, but the HOA to legal liability." The board whispered among themselves, shifting uncomfortably. Karen's face blanched. Then came the coup de grace. From the back of the room, Marcus raised his phone. "I've also got the viral video, if anyone needs a refresher." The room erupted in laughter. Karen's eyes bulged. The chairman banged his gavel. "Enough. The board cannot and will not punish Mr. Miller for lawful use of his property. This matter is closed." Karen shot up, shrieking, "Closed. You'll regret this, all of you." And with that, she stormed out, knocking over a stack of folding chairs in her wake. The neighbors stayed seated for a long moment, stunned. Then slowly applause filled the room. For once, the board had sided with reason instead of Karen's theatrics. But the war wasn't truly over, because the very next weekend, Karen staged her most outrageous stunt yet. It was a blistering Saturday afternoon. Maya and I were lounging in the backyard enjoying cold lemonade when we heard a loud thwack. I checked the cameras and nearly dropped my drink. Karen had returned this time, armed with a garden hose of her own, dragging it across the street from her yard. She'd hooked it up to her spigot and was attempting to spray my lawn in retaliation. Only problem, her hose didn't reach far enough. She strained and yanked the nozzle, sputtering water misting pathetically short of my hedges. Then she tripped the hose, recoiling and soaking her instead. The sensors picked up the movement, and my sprinklers fired in unison. Within seconds, it was chaos again, her hose flailing like a snake water, spraying her from both sides. She slipped, rolled, and finally crawled back across the street, dragging the tangled hose behind her like a defeated knight hauling a broken sword. By then, nearly the whole block had gathered to watch. Someone shouted. Encore kids clapped. Marcus yelled 10 out of 10 would watch again. Karen disappeared into her house, curtains drawn, and for the first time I wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd finally hit rock bottom. Because in that final spectacle, she hadn't just lost a battle. She'd lost the audience. She wasn't feared anymore. She wasn't even hated. She was entertainment. And for someone like Karen, that might have been the cruelest punishment of all. But I also knew humiliation could drive people to desperate lengths. And as I sat on my porch that night, sprinklers hissing softly in the twilight, I couldn't shake the feeling that this saga still had one last act waiting in the wings. The final showdown was coming. I could feel it in the air, heavy and electric, like the moments before a summer storm. And when it broke, it would drench us all. A week passed. The cul-de-sac felt quieter, almost eerily so. Karen hadn't shown her face in days. No binoculars over the hedges, no plastic bags tied to my sprinklers. No rants at the HOA bulletin board. It was as if she'd evaporated, dissolved into the very water that had humiliated her. Part of me wanted to believe it was over, that she'd finally realized she'd gone too far and retreated into silence. But the skeptic in me, the one who'd spent months on edge, knew better. People like Karen don't simply quit. They plot. The storm came on a Saturday evening. The sun was low, casting a warm glow across Maple Ridge Estates. Families barbecued, kids zipped around on scooters, neighbors enjoyed beers on their porches. It should have been peaceful. Then came the metallic clang. I looked up to see Karen, hair, wild clothes, disheveled eyes, manic, marching toward my property. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her trudged two HOA board members, clearly uncomfortable, their expressions caught somewhere between pity and exasperation. Karen clutched a clipboard in one hand, and to my horror, a large bolt cutter in the other. "This is it," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Tonight I free this neighborhood from tyranny." The board members muttered protests, something about this not being official business, but she ignored them, storming straight into my yard. The sprinklers, of course, didn't hesitate. One by one, the heads popped up with their familiar hiss-click, unleashing torrents of water from every angle. The golden light of the sunset turned the spray into shimmering arcs, a watery coliseum. Karen was in the center, thrashing wildly, swinging the bolt cutter like a sword against invisible enemies. She lunged at a sprinkler head, trying to sever it, but each swing brought another blast. Water hammered her face, plastering her hair, soaking her clipboard until the papers bled ink and fell apart. The bolt cutter slipped from her hands into the mud. She fell to her knees, clawing, screaming incoherently about justice and standards. The board members stepped back, horrified. One of them raised a phone to record. Neighbors poured out of their houses, drawn by the noise. Soon the entire cul-de-sac had gathered, watching in stunned silence. The HOA queen bee, the terror of Maple Ridge, reduced to a soaked, raging spectacle on her hands and knees. Then it happened, the moment that sealed her fate. Karen slipped, hard. She toppled backward into a puddle, arms flailing, landing flat on her back with a splash loud enough to echo. The sprinklers continued their relentless assault, jets of water blasting across her like a scene from slapstick theater. She tried to rise, slipped again, and let out a guttural scream that carried across the neighborhood. But instead of sympathy, the crowd laughed. Not cruelly, just uncontrollably. Months of her tyranny dissolved in that moment, washed away with the mud clinging to her raincoat. Even Evelyn, her former ally, chuckled quietly behind her hand. The board members finally stepped forward, pulling Karen to her feet. She jerked away, sobbing, and stumbled off the lawn, leaving a trail of muddy footprints behind. The sprinklers, satisfied, hissed back into silence. No one spoke at first. Then Marcus shouted, 10 points for the sprinkler system. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Applause followed. Some even whistled. That was the last time Karen ever set foot on my property. Within a month, the gossip was everywhere. Karen had resigned from the HOA board. She sold her house at a loss, packed her belongings, and left Maple Ridge Estates under cover of night. Rumor had it she'd moved to a condo complex with no lawns, no gardens, and most importantly, no sprinklers. Life slowly returned to normal. The HOA, perhaps humbled by the spectacle, eased up on its pettiness. Neighbors grew bolder, planting flowers and colors Karen would have banned, hosting backyard parties without fear of surprise inspections. For the first time since I'd moved in, Maple Ridge actually felt like a community. My sprinklers, oh, they stayed. Every head, every sensor, every nozzle remained in place. Not just for hydration, but as a symbol. A reminder that boundaries matter, that privacy deserves respect, and that sometimes the only language bullies understand is the one that soaks them to the bone. Maya and I enjoyed our newfound peace. We hosted barbecues that actually lasted through dessert. We planted new rose bushes without criticism. Occasionally, a neighbor would stop by, glance at the sprinkler system, and grin knowingly. One evening, a young couple who'd just moved into Karen's old house stopped by. The husband, Alex, gestured at my yard and asked, "Hey, why so many sprinklers? Did the previous owner have some sort of water obsession?" I laughed. Not exactly. Let's just say they were installed after an HOA misunderstanding. His wife raised an eyebrow. What kind of misunderstanding? I smirked, clipping a rose. The kind that ends in raincoats, bolt cutters, and a lot of mud. They blinked, confused but amused. I just waved them off. Long story. Welcome to the neighborhood. Trust me, it's quieter now. And it was. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maple Ridge breathed easy. But sometimes late at night, as the sprinklers hissed softly in their scheduled cycles, I caught myself smiling. Not just at the victory, but at the lesson peace is worth fighting for, even if the fight involves gallons of water and a neighbor who refused to mind her own business. If there's one thing this whole ordeal taught me, it's that boundaries are sacred. In life, in relationships, in neighborhoods, you can't let others trample over them no matter how small the trespass seems at first. Because the small things pile up until one day you find yourself staring at a neighbor through binoculars, or worse, swinging a shovel in someone else's roses. We all deserve respect for our space. For me, that respect came not through shouting matches or lawsuits, but through creative persistence and a little humor. Sometimes the best revenge isn't cruel or violent. Sometimes it's simply holding your ground until the bully slips in the mud of their own making. So, wherever you're watching from, ask yourself what boundaries in your life need defending, and how can you stand firm, not with anger, but with a quiet strength that says this far, no further. If you've enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment about your own HOA or neighbor experiences. I know we all have them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales of suburban chaos, revenge, and unexpected justice. Because, trust me, there's always another story waiting just beyond the hedges.